gun violence, much like most injustices, sit at a spectrum, right? So my story of survival will not represent the stories of America. It will only represent my story and my story alone. But I know that in a way that it demonstrates the tragedy and the gruesomeness that it is to survive through a mass shooting. But it is also important to highlight that mass shootings are not the only form of gun violence that impacts America. In fact, it's a very small percentage of what impacts Americans. It's less than like 1.6%. And so I think what he was talking about earlier is very important, is this idea of polarization, this idea of yellow journalism, this idea of, amplifying a story because of the kind of attention and influence that it attracts. And not that my story isn't important, but in many times these mass shootings undermine the other forms of gun violence in our country. And I've had the, gracious opportunity in meeting other survivors of gun violence, meeting even people who themselves have been shooters and aggressors themselves, and the patterns all remain the same. The qualities all remain the same, but they all just come in different forms. And I think the biggest portion in preventing gun violence is the education that surrounds it, the leadership that surrounds it. And two parallels between education and leadership is this idea of survivor leadership. And I think that is one of the most pinnacle points that we can have when it comes to the conversation of gun violence. When it comes to the people who are leading some of the biggest organizations that are fighting gun violence, like the Giffords Foundation, for example. Gabby Giffords is a survivor of gun violence, someone who was literally shot in the head and has been enacting change and was one of the biggest funders for March for Our Lives during that event, working with other organizations that are connecting survivors together and connecting policies to these survivors so they themselves can enact change is important. Because it's about representation. It's about accurately telling the stories of the people who are most impacted by gun violence, opposed to the small percentage that we like to talk about. It is very tragic that children are dying in schools all over America, but it's also very tragic that 60% of gun violence involves gun-related suicides. But that is a conversation that we fail to have. And that's why it is important that stories like my own are shared, but the stories of people whom I may never get to meet, the stories whom will never meet the headlines, the stories whom you will never likely get to know. And that's one of the reasons that I encourage survivor leadership so much, because those stories that we don't get to hear so often, the stories that get forgotten, the stories that we neglect to hear are the ones that fill in that information that we don't know, so that we have a better understanding to why these things reoccur and the way that they do. Some of the biggest historical leaders in America, even going back to the civil rights era, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, they're all people who are survivors in their own right, and people who represent a story and a narrative that we once didn't understand. And I feel that change can only be really enacted is when we have voices that represent the change that we want and accurately desire. And that's why I've been fortunate enough to work with David, because he has that same ideal. The understanding of his own privilege, understanding of his own story is understanding his own story in relation to others, and how they work with one another is so important. And then even broader than that, and even more important, your stories. How does your story interact with the stories of America? How does your personal definition of safety correlate with the definition of safety in your community, in your state? Is this something that you are actively a part of, or you're someone who is a bystander to the things that are around you? I know for a very long time that I was a bystander. I was uneducated. I was uninterested. And more than anything, I was numb. And that's not an attitude to have, because worst case scenario, you get shot. And that's the truth, is that if you don't do something, no one else is going to. And if you don't stand up for yourself, you're going to get stood on. And that's the truth.